Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show inspiring men to be mindful about their lives. Each week, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to men and hear from everyday people doing extraordinary things. So if you love the show, please give it a 5-star rating and share it with your mates. Now, before we get into this week's episode, please note that some of the content may trigger you. And if this happens, please reach out to your support networks. It's really important. If you can't get enough of Mindful Men, head over to our website. It's www.mindful-men.com.au. Find the show notes and the links to our socials there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rinnie, and today we're getting mindful about stories of hope and how our personal pain can be turned into the fuel for our passions. And joining me for today's discussion, I've got Kerrie Atherton from right here on the sunny coast. How you going, Kerrie?
Good, thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, really excited. We've been in each other's circles for a little while and sharing our stories between each other, and I was fortunate enough to come along to one of your stories of hope nights and share my story. So I thought it would be amazing to come to have you on the show and share your story for our broader audience. But to introduce you first, you're the founder of Stories of Hope Australia worldwide. You're the founder of Empower Life Solutions. And so we'll go into both of these today. You're also an author, keynote speaker, you're a trauma and addictions recovery counsellor and a mental health first aid trainer. So it's quite a CV you've got there. But I'm keen to hear, we'll start off because we're both sunny coasters. I don't usually get to interview many people from the Sunshine Coast. Usually they're from all over the world. So what is it about the sunny coast that lights you up?
Being near the beach. I love the ocean, and it's interesting because staring at blue releases endorphins into our body that makes us feel good. So being able to stare at the ocean regularly is really great for my mental health. Just love the cruisy atmosphere, the cafes. I come from Sydney and I actually lived in Newcastle for about 17 years, and I just could not wait to get out of there, and then came to the Sunshine Coast. So it's just so different. It's busy, but not too busy. I like a bit of, action and livelihood and buzz and fun. And the people are just really cruisy. So there's a lot to love about it.
Why did you pick the Sunshine Coast? Of all the places that you could have gone after you left Newcastle, what was the draw here? Did you have people here that you knew already, or you'd holidayed here?
Well, actually, I had holidayed in Mooloolaba a couple of times with my family, and my parents came up to Mooloolaba a few times. But I actually, even though I detested Newcastle, I actually didn't want to move. It was my husband that kept talking about Queensland. And so I kind of had this thing where I thought, if we both say the same place that we want to live on the Sunshine Coast, I'll know that it's meant to be. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, I had Budrum in my head. I said to him, "Oh, where do you want to live on the Sunshine Coast?" And he said, "Budrum." And I'm like, oh, we get moving.
Anyone who's not been to the sunny coast, Budrum is like a hill in the middle of the Sunshine Coast. So you get to see everything from the hinterland to the sea all from one spot.
Yeah, that's it. We get to see everything. But it's so close to, a couple of minutes. Actually, where I am, 5 minutes to Kawana, 5 minutes to Budrum, 5 minutes to Mooloolaba, and 5 minutes to Maroochydore. So It doesn't get better than that, does it?
No, and there's plenty of different ways to see the water from each of those locations as well. And so today we are going to focus on hope. And you have a mental health story. And often when we have a mental health story, we can often lose hope very easily. And we forget kind of how to regain it, but it is possible to regain it. So I really want to highlight that in today's episode of how we go from losing to regaining hope and what hope means for each of us as well. So let's start off with your story. And I guess does it tie in with wanting to leave Newcastle? Where does your story start?
Well, my story starts as a child that went through trauma. And when you spoke at my event, the similarities between our two stories in a lot of ways were unlike I've heard before. The way that you explained the fear and terror that you lived through. It's a very difficult thing to try and explain to someone who hasn't been through it. And as you shared, I just was like, I totally 100% get where he's coming from. But I grew up in a home with two alcoholic parents in Sydney, and I suffered a series of traumas as a young person, which included being bullied for many years at school, a sexual assault by a pedophile when I was on holidays, witnessing my mum being electrocuted. And she came back to life, but that just left such an impact and a terrible fear in me of losing people close to me, witnessing that. And at 10, I was put under the care of a psychiatrist because I had a breakdown, and that was kind of my start to the mental health journey, I guess. My dad had chronic PTSD because he was brought up in a home with two alcoholic parents. His mother was extremely violent. And his dad was actually a very well-known musician at the Tivoli and was out at nights. And my dad would often have to lock himself in his room because his mother would come in with knives and stuff like that. And the amount of times he came home from school to see her passed out as a primary school student, had to ring the ambulance and things like that were just too many to count. So my dad taught me to fear everything. So I was like born into fear. And there's a real bent these days in research towards the fact that post-traumatic stress can be passed on through the genes. And I really believe that I probably inherited that from what he went through. But I started to live in this terrible fear and hopelessness after my mum and dad took me to the police after the sexual assault on holidays. And it ended up being the son of the owner of the holiday cabins. And back in those days, you didn't give a credit card, you gave your name, address and phone number, so they knew where we lived. And because of that fact, I was catapulted into a world of terror, even though we were going back home the next day, packing up and just leaving on my brother's birthday, his 8th birthday. I knew that that person knew where I lived. And so then that started this terrible set of events where I never felt safe in my home from that point on. We lived on a 4-lane highway, and I was absolutely convinced that this person was going to track me down and kill me. So I started to develop these rituals, as we talked about and you've shared in your story, thinking that, you know, if I did these things, for instance, like there was 5 members of my family. If I had a biscuit or something, I'd have to have 5. If I'd tap things all the time, everything I did had to be in 5s to represent each member of the family. And I'd think that if I only did 4, something would happen to one of the family. I was tormented by fear and terror. And there was no haven at home because I felt so unsafe, and then no haven at school because I was bullied. So I was prescribed anti-anxiety medication and antidepressant medication at 10, and I became addicted to that because I just wanted an escape from the demons in my head. There was just no turning off what was going on up here, no peace. I'd have a lot of times of happiness and joy in our family unit because even though my mum was still an active alcoholic then, we still had a lot of great family times and I was very loved by my parents. But that happiness was always overshadowed by the fear and terror and knowing that the nighttime was coming and I probably wouldn't be sleeping. So the nights were the worst. And it's very interesting because as a counsellor today, so many people that I see come to me in middle age, and it's always as a result of unresolved childhood trauma. And so I think what happens is people just lock that stuff away and they don't deal with it. And it stays in, you know, it's got to go somewhere, and then it just resurfaces later on in life. And what we do is we normalise what's going on because we don't know any different. So I didn't really realise, I felt very different from the rest of the world, and I was born into alcoholism as well. 4 members of my own family were alcoholics, my grandparents. And I can remember never feeling like I fitted in, always feeling like everyone was staring at me and like a raw exposed nerve, really. So pills took that away. And then as soon as I could at 15, I took my first drink of alcohol and it just obliterated everything. And I thought, this is what I need to get through life. It made me feel normal, took away all the anxiety, all the fear, and just blotted everything out. So that was kind of what I was after from that point, was obliteration from reality, something to give me the ability to communicate with other people, because without alcohol, I felt like I couldn't have a conversation with anyone. And I remember, it's just come to me now, that my self-esteem was so low that was one of the reasons why I couldn't communicate with people. And I remember walking down the street when I was working in the city of Sydney, and I would always walk with my head down, because the fear of looking at someone in the eyes was really big for me. And I had my head down, and I actually walked into a taxi and it slammed its brakes on. So I almost got run over that day, but because I walked with my head down all the time, I didn't want to look at people. I felt totally unworthy, worthless, useless, no self-esteem whatsoever. I hated myself. And I hated myself because I felt like everyone else hated me. I being bullied at school and then being assaulted by somebody, it sent messages to me that I was damaged and that something was wrong with me. So I just sought total oblivion from that. And my alcoholism escalated really quickly. You know, within about 3 to 6 months of starting drinking, everybody in my life, my boyfriend, my parents, all my parents' friends that were in AA. So I actually didn't really get a good shot at drinking, because I had all the sober alcoholics on my back saying, you've got a problem, you know, you need to give up drinking. And I'm like, I'm only 16, you know, I'm just starting, you know, my life's just beginning, and how could I have a problem? But I guess my story is a real message to anybody out there, to any parent who thinks that their kid's too young to have a problem, and to any person who's struggling with addiction. And in my line of work, I see so many young people today who are struggling with addiction, but they think they're too young. Nobody's too young to actually give this attention and stop. And Mum and Dad took me to an AA meeting when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And I was in that meeting thinking, you know, everyone was ancient and they were probably about the age I am now. But they'd point to me and they'd say, I wish I found this when I was your age, this young girl in the room. Because if I did, I wouldn't have lost my family. I wouldn't have murdered that person. I wouldn't have ended up in jail. I wouldn't have ended up in a psych ward. I wouldn't have lost everything. I wouldn't have lost my children. And those words just rang in my ears, you know, to think that it was a warning. And I thought, I'd hear horror stories in those rooms, you know, and I went just to appease my parents. But in the back of my mind, I thought, something's just really not right with me. And if I ever do need help, I know that this will be the place to come, because there are other people struggling with alcohol. And I couldn't work out why I'd only set out to have 2 drinks, but I would end up paralytic every time and wake up on, you know, people's fences in the middle of nowhere with strangers in strangers' beds, you know. And I never, ever knew how it happened, how I got there. All I knew was I'd set out to have a couple of drinks that night before, and there's many things that I can't remember. And I was recently giving this a lot of thought last year only, because I still have flashbacks from the past and I can never put the pieces back together again. And I came up with this saying that for a recovering alcoholic or addict, life is like an unsolved jigsaw puzzle, one of which you can never, ever put the pieces back together again. But something wonderful, though, about that is that you can make a new jigsaw puzzle. And, you know, that's what I've been able to do out of my life. So at 18, everything became so hopeless. I'd been in violent relationships, other things had happened to me. I'd experienced multiple traumas while drunk, and I hit total rock bottom, and I thought, I can't live anymore. I don't know how to live anymore. And I would like to give a warning now about suicide. But that day I decided to end my life. And right then at that moment, I heard a loud voice say, "Don't do it. If you hang on a bit longer, you'll find happiness one day." And I'd been brought up with a faith, but I wasn't walking in that faith. But I really believe that day, that was the voice of God giving me second chance. And that day I rang Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was the place to go. I knew that it was my last stop. If it didn't work, I was out of here. I had no hope left. And the truth is, for many people that feel like they're so hopeless that they want to end their life, they don't actually want to die. They just don't know how to live anymore. And that was how I got to. So through the 12-step program, I learned new strategies on how to live my life, how to find meaning, how to find purpose, how to forgive myself and forgive others, how to find gratitude, how to find a new set of connections, and finding like-minded people who understood the trauma that I'd been through was just life-saving. That feeling of loneliness and, being alone in a crowd even, I still struggled with it, but knowing that other people felt the same way as that was really life-saving for me. And I think that went on to be a catalyst for me to start Stories of Hope down the track. Yeah, so then I actually entered another very abusive relationship the first week that I got sober, and I stayed in that relationship for 3 years. I don't know how I stayed sober through that time, but that relationship was very, very abusive and did a lot more damage to me. But what it did was, and I say this to a lot of people that go through relationship breakdowns, each relationship that breaks down brings you one step closer to knowing who you're meant to be with. And I always wanted to have a guy that loved me just for who I was inside, not for what I looked like on the outside or any other reason, and somebody that treated me well. And I didn't ever think I deserved someone like that. So I had many relationships, and they were always settled with whoever would have me because my self-esteem was so low. And I was addicted to relationships as well. I thought, if I don't have a boyfriend, I'm worth nothing. That was kind of where my value lay, and it was the only thing really in which my value lay. But I met my now husband 3 years after I got sober, and we've been married for, I don't know, about 37 years, I think now. So that's been amazing that we've stayed together that long, and we've been great for each other. He's leveled me out, and he's never been bored.
It is an amazing story, Kerrie, and some of that I have never heard before. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm interested with your husband, and when you met him, how was he different to all the other relationships, the toxic relationships that you'd been through prior to that?
Well, this is an interesting fact, but he'd actually been brought up as a Christian, and he was in a family, I can only describe it as the Brady Bunch without the family separation, because they just didn't ever seem to have any problems. Incidentally, they did go through a very big trauma when he lost his uncle, but the kids were always shielded from everything, and everything was always seemed perfect. And my hubby left home at 18, and he actually never really experienced trauma. So in one sense, he's never understood me, and that's okay. We've learnt how to manage that. He lives quite emotionally disconnected, because if somebody hasn't suffered, they can't resonate with the person that's suffering because they don't understand what suffering is. They can stand on the sidelines and offer sympathy, but they can't have empathy. Yeah, so he never really suffered any trauma. He had no baggage. And I had all the baggage in the world. Like, I had 50 million suitcases. And I remember the day I told him I was an alcoholic. And we say that because, and people try and argue about this, but a true alcoholic can never drink again. I could never stop at one drink back then, and I'm convinced that I will not be able to stop at one drink now, and I'm not prepared to forego my sobriety, and my kids have never seen me drunk. I'm not prepared to give that all up to try and have a shot at seeing whether I can be a social drinker. And I've had many people try and encourage me to do that. But for me, I'm not prepared to give up my 41 years of sobriety to try and, look, I miss it. When I think about Kahlua and Coke, it was like I had it yesterday and it was my favourite drink. And we've just had a lot of family celebrations overseas. We went on a holiday and everyone was drinking, and I'm like, oh. And over there in America, all they got is lime and soda, and I'm like, this is so boring. But I don't think about it long enough for it to get a pathway in here. I can't afford to.
So you guys are like almost polar opposites.
Oh, totally.
How did you make it work though? Because often, like, I've been in a relationship, and I shared a little bit of this on the night that I came out and did Stories of Hope, was in these other relationships that I was in, the initial ones, we were chalk and cheese, and we just couldn't find that level playing field where it just worked and it clicked. So it always failed. The relationships always failed. How did you make it work?
Well, look, I'm going to get a bit super spiro here, and I don't often bring this into podcasts, but you asking this question, I can only be honest. And at the time, we fought every single day. The abusive relationship that I'd been in for 3 years was so damaging that I was absolutely convinced that my husband was going to be like the other guy who had told me that all men were like him, and he was a serial pervert, just very perverted in a lot of ways and very flirty with other women and everything like that. And I was absolutely convinced that he told me for 3 years, he brainwashed me that every guy was like that. So then when I met my husband, who was actually nothing like that, I was convinced that he was exactly the same and he was going to leave me. And we would go into restaurants, and this is, a lot of people will relate to this, but they'll never admit it. We'd go into restaurants and I'd book the table facing the wall, and I would sit down and make sure that he had the seat that faced the wall, because I thought that if he saw somebody in the restaurant, if he was facing the people and saw someone that looked better than me, or that he would leave me. And I was that insecure that I had a massive jealousy problem, which drove so many arguments in our relationship. And we fought every day, because every single day I basically accused him of perving at people. And we started going to church after a couple of years, because there was one night, I think we'd just got engaged and we had a massive fight, and I felt like I couldn't go on. And I remember falling to my knees in the lounge room, and I begged God to take away my emotional problems. It was another fight about jealousy, and it was destroying me. I was absolutely terrified of who I would become when I would get jealous. I had no control. And I said, if you take away my jealousy and anger, I will go back to church. But I said, I'm not going back to the Catholic Church, because that's what I grew up in, and I thought that was really boring. So I thought I'd have a go at going to the one that my hubby went to if God came through on his end of the deal. And I started to change. It was like something just started transforming in me, and the anger started to disperse, the jealousy and everything. So I went along and started going to church, but we would still fight. And I remember this one particular morning where we'd had a massive fight on the way to church, and I had my husband by the hair as he was driving, and we were screaming at each other, and it was our year anniversary, and I thought, I don't think we can stay together. This is just too hard. And he was feeling the same. And we walked into that church, and there was about 1,500 people there. And the minister said, I'm looking for a guy and his wife. And he pointed to Martin and said, you with that watch. And I don't know what it was about the watch, but he said, can you come up the front? And he said to us the first thing, God wants you to know this day that he has brought you together. And those words actually were the catalyst for saving our marriage every single time it got so hard. I never forgot those words.
Wow. It's amazing how things like that happen. Like, I'm not an overly religious person, or I'm not really religious at all. I believe there's something else out there, like a spiritual element or something like that. My wife, she's Catholic and the kids are Catholic and all that. But I remember as you were saying that, like my rock bottom moment where I was thinking about suicide and being in bed as that 13, 14-year-old boy, petrified of what lies outside that window, outside that door. This phrase came into my mind. I never knew where it came from. It was like, Simon, it's going to be okay. The sun will always rise tomorrow.
Wow.
And I don't know where this came from. And that gave me a glimmer, a small glimmer of hope that if I can get through each dark night and then each dark day, that there's always going to be a new beginning tomorrow, a new opportunity for things to be okay the next day. And so that it was very superficial at that point. But as I've gotten older, I'm a lot more reflective of that moment and these personal mantras and the power of mantras or affirmations or sayings or whatever it is, whether it's religious or non-religious as well, can have this profound impact on us and give us this newfound hope for a relationship or a mental health condition or addiction or whatever it is. And so I'm glad that came into your life and obviously you've been going strong ever since. How has your story impacted you as a mum, though?
Wow, as a mum. It's interesting because I have a daughter and a son, and they're 4 years apart. And my daughter's 34, just turned 34. But when she was I think she must have been in year 6 or 7, I had very bad postnatal depression with especially Alicia. And then I had postnatal depression 4 years later when my son Josh was born. And then I got glandular fever 2 years after that. And I was very emotionally disturbed a lot of their early childhood. There'd be days when I say this, I was bad, but compared to the person that I'd been, I was streets ahead in recovery, But there'd be days when my hubby had come home and I'd just be lying in a heap on the lounge, inconsolable, and the kids would just be running around the lounge room. So I carried a lot of shame about my past, and I knew that there would be a day when I'd have to tell my kids, when I did feel like I wanted to tell them, because I wanted them to know that I wasn't broken or why I was the way I was, why I was so overprotective. I never let them go anywhere because of what happened to me when I was on holidays when I was 9 years old by the pedophile. So I was so overprotective. But my daughter was in probably year 7 and she came home from school and she'd done a health and wellbeing class. And she was talking about, they talked about, drugs and alcohol. And I just felt it was the right time to talk to her about my past. And I said, I've got something to tell you, about my life as a young person. And I was really terrified that she'd view me in a different way. And so I told her, about my story. I always get choked up when this part comes. And then a couple of days later, she came home and she said, we have to do a project, Mum, on somebody that we admire. And I'm doing my project on you. And it was at that point I thought, it's okay. She sees me in a different light, but she sees me in a greater light. And she's always been so supportive, and that kind of gave me the avenue to know then that I could also be open with my son. I just have such a fantastic relationship with both my kids. I've had to learn about emotional regulation because I sought a lot of validation from my daughter, and that comes from my relationship with my mum. She wasn't, when I was growing up, not a nurturer at all, and I always kind of wondered where I stood. And so my relationship with my daughter, we only know how to parent as we go because no one's shown us before and we only have the role model we had. And so we're learning at each stage as we go. Yeah, so I have a great relationship with my kids today, and they really admire me and are proud of everything that I've overcome and what I do to help others today.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like, as someone who lives with a mental health condition as well, like I often feel that I'm the failure of the family, particularly when I'm dysregulated and really struggling, and maybe I'm letting the kids see me cry. But often they always come up and give me a cuddle and say, "Daddy, are you okay?" And every time they tell me that they love me, it's a real boost of energy for me, because I often feel like I'm not doing good enough as a parent. But it's those little things that I think they see, that we're just human, we're not robots, which is very different to growing up. Like, I didn't have that growing up. And if I showed emotion, it was, this is the 80s and 90s. It's the suck it up, be a man, boys don't cry type mentality, because that's what my parents knew. As you just said, like, we get a blueprint of the parents before us as well. And so now I'm in that kind of like tug of war between, how do I be a parent? How do I not show too much emotion, but how do I show enough so that they know it's okay to be not okay? But I think it often comes back to me saying that to myself and going, it's okay for me to have my flaws, but they're my strengths as well, because I am a resilient person. For so long, I didn't realize what resilience was. I didn't have hope. But it's sharing these stories with each other that we do highlight to so many others that there is hope out there, that we can change and change for the better too.
Absolutely. And as you were sharing, and then you beat me to the point, I counsel a lot of men. I do a lot of work with men's mental health. And one of the things that so many guys say to me is that they were never allowed to show their emotions as a child. And so now as an adult too, they find it very difficult. But I think the wonderful thing that you're demonstrating to your next generation is that it's okay to show emotion.
Yeah.
And that is very freeing. You're giving your kids permission to be open about their feelings. And so I think that's a wonderful thing.
And they're taking that and running at the moment. My 6-year-old boy, he's taking that permission and running like you wouldn't believe, which is really cute. And it's great to see him trying to process these big emotions as a 6-year-old. And my daughter, she's not far behind him as an almost 4-year-old. So we're in the thick of emotional dysregulation in our household. We've touched on a few times stories of hope. And so I'm really keen to hear about how Stories of Hope came about, the inspiration for it, and why do you think it's so important for people, everyday people, to share their stories?
Well, Stories of Hope came about through my own rock bottom. Look, I've had 3 rock bottoms in my life. The first was 10, when I was put under the care of a psychiatrist. The second was when I was 18 and planned to end my life. And then the third rock bottom was around 7 years ago now. It was in 2017. And my mum had passed away from cancer. A year before that, her half-brother, who was 6 years older than me, also died. Cousin was killed in a motorbike accident 4 months after my mum died. Grandparents died 2 years after that. About 4 aunties and uncles all passed away. My dad was diagnosed with the last stages of emphysema, and then he passed away. And then just when that happened, my husband was diagnosed with an illness. He had a breakdown and had to give up work, and was told that he had the bones of an 85-year-old and was diagnosed with osteoporosis, amongst like just everything else that was going on. And I felt like an orphan. I had nobody above me anymore. My dad was the one that I used to go to all the time for support. And my husband, who had been a source of strength for me, had collapsed, and I just didn't know where to turn. Like, life just seemed so uncertain and so hopeless. And also add to that my son also, who I was really close to, who had done lots of the visits with me to visit my parents in and out of hospital, and he'd kind of turned into the emotional rock that I leaned on. As much as you don't want your kids to have to play that role, he just took that on, and he left home and moved to Sydney. And so I just was desolate. I can't explain the grief with everything. It was vicarious trauma, one trauma after another and add to that, like, my husband had an accident, smashed his collarbone to pieces, and I was involved in a car accident where we were hit at 140 kilometres an hour the week that I went off on stress leave from work, and had chronic whiplash for 3 years, and like things like that, which are normally a big trauma for a lot of people just faded into the background compared to everything else. So I was like running constantly, just trying to keep my head above water, just trying to function. I had no time to process anything. And then everything just came crashing down on me this, 6-7 years ago. And I locked myself away for about 2 months, hardly saw anyone, checked out of all my regular activities. And I felt like drinking again. I was just giving it a lot of thought, about drinking would take away all this pain and everything. And anyway, I had the insight in the middle of all of that to realise that I was slipping really fast. And I've been able to pull myself out so often before. And I really acknowledged at that point too that I had in fact actually still had a struggle with depression, which I'd never focused on a lot. And I thought, if I don't stop isolating, this is going to have a very bad ending. So I forced myself to go to a women's conference where I knew that there was caring people. And I heard 3 people sharing their stories of overcoming very hard times. And I cried through the whole thing because I understood the pain that they were going through. But it made me know that I was going to be okay. And I had a light bulb moment in that conference. And I thought, gosh, I've come out of the other side of so many things. I can come out the other side of this. I am so resilient. And if I could share my stories of everything, every situation that I've come out of, every topic, and also gather all the other people that I knew in the community, because I'm a real connector, and share their stories, I thought together we can literally make a massive difference on the Sunshine Coast. So people know that they're not alone. And that's really the cry of my heart, is that people don't feel alone in their pain, because I felt so alone. And also suicide prevention. Since that day when I was 18, whatever I can do to help somebody know that life will get better and not check out has been a real mission. So that's how Stories of Hope started. I thought I'll just start a small group. I didn't think anyone would turn up. And the fear of not achieving my dreams in life became so much greater than the fear of stepping out and facing that public humiliation and rejection if it didn't work. But I set up the first meeting and 30 people came into the door that night who shared my vision. And since that day, for 5 years, every single month, I put on a free event for the community. Because when I was in the middle of my pain, what I so desperately wanted was to find somebody that I could talk to that understood the level of trauma that I'd been through, and I couldn't find anyone. So creating this space for people lets them know that there's somebody else there for them. And the person that's come out the other side is the greatest example of hope to anybody that's still on the journey.
It is an amazing night. I remember when I walked in, you invited me along to share my story, and I'm just like, oh my God, look at all the chairs. Like, how am I going to get through this? A few weeks ago, we had Rosie Rasmussen come on, who came on the same night that I did and shared her story. And has there been a particular or series, or well, maybe if you can't pick a particular guest that's come through the doors that's really had a profound impact, maybe a theme or something, like things that people have talked about that have really hit home for you? What's been a shining light for you?
Oh, that everyone asks me that question, and it's just really, everybody's story has just been so amazing. There hasn't actually been a highlight, but something that really sticks in my mind is I contacted an ex-detective. He was actually a leading detective on the Daniel Morcombe case, and he left the force with PTSD after that. And he came along to my second event, and he loved it so much that he actually joined my team and became my number one, I don't know what, your team member. And he was with me right through up till COVID. His name's Stuart Rawlins, and he's a wonderful guy. And together we created, men's mental health nights, and he ran them for me. And he was just always a person that was just there. He walked through the Stories of Hope vision with me and was always there. But he shared his story, I think a couple of months after that he came along. And his neighbour came along to hear him. And she had her own story. She'd been diagnosed with Lyme disease and had almost died from Lyme disease and became so hopeless that she wanted to give up. And I think Stuart made a comment about Trudy that night, and he said it's just so strange, and he said it and sad to think that you can be living just around the corner from somebody and they can be struggling so much and you have no idea what they're going through. And he had used to see Trudy out walking her dog all the time, and then he didn't see her anymore. And he said, I wondered, I wonder why I don't see Trudy anymore. But behind closed doors, Trudy was fighting for her life for months. And here they meet up at Stories of Hope, and Trudy became a member of the team as well. And she's still a close friend today, and she's been there right from the beginning. And to see them both up sharing their stories and knowing that they were neighbours and they were both in the fight for their life, but neither one knew because of this disconnection that we have in society, and you don't knock on your neighbour's door like you used to back in the day. So I think that was something that really sticks in my mind. And they're both doing so fabulously well today. Stu's got a massive job as, head of safety for a mining company, and Trudy's got her own breathing business now where she teaches people to breathe properly, and they're really thriving. They're amazing stories of hope, those two.
You've got a few books of it now, like where you're putting these stories. And one of the books, which I'm really excited about, is The Big Fly you've got behind you. I've got a copy at home here as well.
Yeah.
Is around lightbulb moments through the eyes of men.
Yeah.
And so as a guy who works in this field, I know how hard it is for guys to even open up in the first place. In fact, it took me 20 years to go and see that GP for the first time and say, I think I have a mental health condition. I need help.
Yeah.
How hard did you find it to get enough blokes together to share their stories and then put it in a book?
Not hard at all. I don't know. I guess because I grew up with brothers and my mum being an alcoholic till I was 12, my dad was the one that basically emotionally brought me up and talked to me about all the stuff that mum should talk about. And I grew up watching boxing and, wrestling, and I was bullied severely by women. So I had a lot of guy friends, and my passion to help men because of my uncle who had a severe battle with schizophrenia and drug-induced psychosis, and my own dad and different guys through the program, I know that I had become friends with that had really struggled. I felt that the men that I approached were just really thankful for the opportunity to be able. Was like I gave them permission to share. Like they felt like you need an invitation or permission to share, but they jumped at the fact. But it all came about this book through COVID because our events were shut down and I hit a really low point in my own mental health with my purpose taken away and not being able to connect with my family in Sydney and everything. And feeling helpless as a counsellor and person that helps other people. I felt helpless seeing the hopelessness in the world. So I thought, what can I do that can help others and give me a redefined purpose? So I started interviewing really resilient people that basically, I think through LinkedIn, that I'd seen on LinkedIn and some on Facebook, but mainly LinkedIn. And I started interviewing all these people, men and women, and I have about 50 of those interviews now, which I'm trying to turn into a podcast. But they were amazing stories, and I just really wanted to – there was a lot of talk about the suicide rate with men. 5 out of 6 suicides are men. And so because of that, I really wanted to dedicate this book to men. So I drew 15 of the stories of the interviews that I'd had, and they're the guys that are in the book.
I think you highlighted a great point there, is that guys actually do want to share their story. They just need the right platform or space to do it. And often the guys that come into my therapy clinic, they're like, Simon, I've never done this before. I don't know what to expect. And they're freaking out just by that prospect. And so me, after about half an hour of a bit of gas bagging and all that, we get into the serious stuff. And then they're like, oh, this is actually pretty easy. Like, I can do this. And they keep coming back and they keep coming back. And so I think you've highlighted a great point there, is that, yes, it is hard for guys to open up about this stuff, but when they're given the opportunity in a safe space, some gold stuff comes out, some gold that highlights to other guys out there and women as well and kids, is that it's okay to be not okay. We can get through whatever these traumas are or challenges are, and we can come out the other side a lot better person for it.
Yeah, and that was the goal of the book. I'd see so many people in counselling whose lives have totally fallen apart. And often, because I'm an addictions counsellor as well, that's a big reason for that. But so often a lot of pain can be prevented. And so I see myself as an interventionist. So early intervention and prevention is the thing that I'm really passionate about, because there's nothing sadder than sitting with somebody who has lost everything or who has hit rock bottom and helping them try to mop up the rest of their life. If people would only seek help earlier, a lot of that heartache can actually be prevented. And so that's really the message behind this book, and here I've got on the back of the book, find hope and be inspired as you read the personally written stories of 15 brave men from their 20s to their 80s who laid themselves emotionally bare on the pages of this book as they share their moments of regret, shame, heartache, disappointment and resilience, but more importantly, that pivotal moment of hope that led them to wake up and realise that change could be made on the other side and that life could get better. Their wake-up call could be your switch to turn on the light and climb out of the darkness. And these guys hold nothing back in the book. As you've read it, they lay themselves emotionally bare, and it's an invitation really to any man that's reading to know that it's okay to open up and be vulnerable.
And it's a healthy thing as well. Like, it's healthy to, as you said, to prevent it.
Yeah.
So often we wait until the car's broken down before we go get it fixed, or at least that happens often in my household.
Yeah,
But if we keep it regularly serviced with whatever wellness activity that is, whether it's therapy, whether it's stopping drinking, maybe it's improving your diet, exercise regularly, sleep, all the stuff. Like, we don't all have to be in therapy, but therapy certainly does help. And so let's talk about therapy. You founded Empower Life Solutions as well. Talk us a bit about the clinic and the kind of, you said addictions counselling as well. Do you just focus on addictions counselling?
No, I've been counselling for 15 years now, and literally every topic in life, every age. I've had children. I've done a lot of work with young people on the Sunshine Coast. I've worked in and out of schools for 12 years with at-risk kids and their families. And, my oldest clients are in their 80s. It's really predominantly anybody that's been through some kind of trauma or something's happened and they just don't know how to get from A to B, or mental health. A lot more people are struggling with mental health today. I think a lot of people seek me out who have problems with addictions because I've walked the road. And I think that that's a very important point for anybody that's listening. Seeking help is the number one thing that you should do to be able to improve your life. But it's seeking the right help, finding the right therapist that's walked the journey that you actually want to walk and you want to recover in. And so I've been able to, having, 41 years of sobriety and so much resilience behind me in that area, I get a lot of people coming to me for addictions counselling and trauma counselling.
I love that point, because so many therapists I've been to in my own personal journey, I haven't really connected with because I haven't sensed that shared lived experience.
Yeah.
But then the ones that I have sensed that shared lived experience, and maybe they've opened up a little bit about theirs, I've just had so much better results through those types of relationships as well. And so I value myself as a lived experience therapist in areas such as OCD, depression, anxiety, burnout, using alcohol to suppress everything. I fly that flag and say, hey, if that's what you've been struggling with, seek me out, because I kind of get it. And it's so important.
I think people need to know, and I think this is something that's such an important point, is something about me is that, despite what I believe, I am so non-judgmental. And I think people that come to me and they've expressed this is that to know that they can open up and share their deepest, darkest secrets and shame, and to know that after that they're still going to be accepted, is massive.
Absolutely. It's huge. It's that fear of rejection or being shamed or being ridiculed or being laughed at stops so many people from seeking that help out in the first place. And so good therapists can do that. They can hold that space and hear it all. Like I've heard so many different stories as well through my clients.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite, as a therapist myself, I really cherish that relationship and hearing those stories because I get a lot of strength and insights into the human resilience that I wouldn't necessarily get if I still worked in my old corporate job.
Yeah, that's right. I know. There's such a joy about walking through a journey with somebody and seeing them shine and find a bit of hope at the end. Money can't buy that.
No.
It's a very special privilege, isn't it?
So, Kerrie, if people have been listening and they want to check out the books, maybe where's the best place they can buy a book from you?
Yeah, through my website, www.storiesofhope.com.au. And, you can send me a message on there on Facebook, on the Stories of Hope Australia Facebook page. The book's out on audio now, as of about a week ago. And the guy that has narrated that for me is a field officer in charge of mates in construction. And that's Justin G. Ange, and he's a lived experience worker as well. And he's got an amazing voice, but could deliver the book in a way because he understands the journey of men's mental health. So contact me any way you want through those two avenues.
What about Empower Life Solutions? What's the best place for them if they want to touch base with you there?
Probably to send me an email at info@empowerlifesolutions.com.au. or the website www.empowerlifesolutions.com.au.
Awesome. And I'll put the links in the show notes so people can access them readily if they don't have a pen and paper right now when they're listening to this. But Kerrie, thanks so much for coming on. I really have enjoyed our conversation. I always do like to catch up with you and hear what's been going on in your neck of the woods. But the last question I ask every guest is to plug something that makes you feel good. And the reason I ask this question is because we do talk about some heavy stuff in the show. So leaving it on a bit of a lighter note, something that's lighting you up, that you're getting some joy out of, and it could be anything from a book, a TV show, some music listening to, a self-care activity. What's lighting you up at the moment?
I think what's really lit me up in the last 2 weeks is I've been away with my family on a holiday, and they're my fun people. Like, we need laughter, and especially in the line of work that we do when we're listening to heavy stuff, like you said, but we just laughed our heads off together. And I think finding joy in people that you connect with, whether it's family or friends, find people that you can laugh with. And that's what's really lit me up.
Yeah, love it. Where did you go? Where was the holiday?
Hawaii.
Oh, amazing.
And I know not everyone can go to Hawaii, but one of the things that I was so grateful for was that I was coming back home to the Sunshine Coast.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, we live in, heaven on earth here on the Sunshine Coast, and it's about 25% cheaper than Hawaii.
Yeah.
So being in Hawaii and spending the money on food there made me so grateful for how cheap the prices here are on the Sunshine Coast, despite what people think.
Absolutely. Whenever I need to go on a holiday, I just go to Noosa.
Yeah, that's my other go-to.
But it's probably just as expensive as Hawaii. So
you don't have to give the mandatory 20% tip at Noosa.
No. But Kerrie, thanks so much for coming on. I really have enjoyed our time and appreciate you getting mindful about hope with me.
Thank you, Simon. Always a pleasure to catch up with you.
Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.